I was saying that we should put the multiple crises that the world is currently going through into the context of the fact that business is one of the most important institutions in our lives. It clothes, feeds, and houses us. It employs us, and it invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity, the growth of nations, and the alleviation of poverty around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of growing environmental degradation, global warming emissions, biodiversity loss, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. And just to bring out the point about that last factor, trust, this slide here is a slide that shows the level of trust that Edelman, the organization that does a barometer of trust around the world, produced last year of trust in business in 28 countries around the world. And it shows that, well, first of all, I'm afraid to say that trust in business in Japan is rather near the bottom. Only not quite as bad as that in my country, the UK. And at the bottom, according to this, comes South Korea. But what I really want to emphasize is that more significantly, if you look at this, a more striking feature is that trust in business is actually lowest in developed countries. So that countries which have the best corporate systems, financial sectors, and legal and regulatory systems are the ones that apparently have the lowest levels of trust in their businesses. And the countries where there's significantly higher levels of trust in business are developing and emerging markets. And so, quite contrary to what one's expectations might be, trust in business is lowest in the apparently best organized and best run economies. And we might think about why that's the case. But the barometer goes on and talks about the difference of trust that people have in their own employers. And it shows that the level of trust in employers is higher than people trust businesses in general. And again, as you can see from this slide here, levels of trust in Japan, even in one's own employers, is pretty low in comparison to that in other countries. And again, what one observes is that in the developed world of Europe and North America and Asia, levels of trust in employers is less than it is in emerging markets and developing countries. And a final element that I want to just mention in relation to this survey is that it finds that the level of trust in different types of businesses varies appreciably, and in particular in relation to the ownership of companies. And that trust in family-owned businesses is greater than that in other types of privately held businesses, such as private equity firms, which in turn is greater than the level of trust in publicly listed companies on stock markets, which is greater than that in state-owned corporations. So trust in family businesses is greater than it is in other types of companies. And that might pertain to the observation that I just made about the relatively low levels of trust in business in Japan, because since the Second World War, family ownership of large listed companies in Japan has been very low in relation to that of other countries because of the dissolution of the zaibatsus in the post-Second World War period. Now, what this raises is the question of why is it that people have low levels of trust in business? And how does this relate to issues around economic performance and broader measures of performance of economies and nations around the world? And in that regard, there's a very significant debate that is currently in progress around the relatively modest performance of the Japanese economy over the last decade, or 2 or 3 decades. And in particular, it's reflected in a concern about the low levels of growth, investment, productivity, and international competitiveness of the Japanese economy. And in response to that, there have been proposals initiated by Prime Minister Abe to reform corporate governance. Initially around thinking about it in terms of reform of the boards of companies and how boards operated. But more recently, it's come to focus on questions around the ownership of companies, and in particular, the unwinding of cross-shareholdings, which were felt to have inhibited the performance of companies by essentially helping management to entrench themselves from outside interference in the running of their companies and outside engagement. And so over the last few years, in particular, we've seen a steady erosion of cross-shareholdings, and in their place have come increased levels of foreign institutional shareholdings in general, but in particular, foreign institutional shareholdings. And partly associated with that has been the growth of what one might term markets for corporate control. Active engagement by investors, in particular hedge fund activism, and takeovers, and in particular, hostile takeovers. Now, this has really, in many respects, achieved what it intended to do, and that is to encourage a greater level of incentives and motivation and improve performance of the corporate sector in Japan. But it's raising a concern as to whether or not this might come contrary to the other objectives that Japanese policymakers have in terms of thinking about the well-being of the economy more generally than just its economic performance. And in particular, it's important to note that Japan is a country where levels of social harmony have remained relatively high in relation to most other countries around the world. It hasn't experienced the same levels of polarization of society that's been observed in many other countries. And so there's a concern that, well, perhaps this move to what one in America would describe as being raw capitalism would have adverse consequences for levels of harmony, social harmony in Japan. And likewise, whether or not this could come at the detriment of environmental objectives and concerns, and whether or not the environment can be protected in the context of this greater emphasis on efficiency and profits of companies. There's a particular issue that's obviously emerged over the last few months about the extent to which it's possible to maintain a policy of promoting anything other than economic efficiency and financial performance in the face of other countries that are deregulating their economies rapidly in relation to environmental and social considerations. So really the issue is it feasible for Japan to sustain an appropriate level of balance between economic efficiency and social harmony going forward? Now, to answer that question, I think it's important to really understand and recognize what is the underlying issue and problem that's giving rise to these concerns. And what I argue in my book is that the primary consideration is what lies at the heart of a capitalist system, and in particular at the heart of business. It's the fuel that powers business, it's the source of the resources of business, and it's the incentive that motivates people in business and people who invest in business. And that is the profit of a business. Milton Friedman famously said in 1960 that there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. Now, he was quite right to emphasize the importance of profit. Profit is actually absolutely at the heart of business. Without profit, there's no capital in capitalism. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that we are misconceiving what is meant, or what was meant, by the notion of a profit. The word profit comes from the Latin proficere, profectus, which means to advance and progress. And that is precisely where a profit should come from advancement and progress. But too often it also comes from advantage and regress, going backwards, not necessarily forwards. And to understand why that's the case, one really needs to lift up the hood and bonnet of capitalism and look and see what lies beneath. And when one does that, this is basically what one sees. That the profit of a company, as it's conventionally measured, is the difference between the revenue of a company and its measured costs. Its measured costs are its labor costs, its supply costs, and its capital costs. And the difference between the revenue and the measured costs are the measured profit of a business, as shown in yellow here. But that's not really what the profit of a business is, because that doesn't take account of the extent to which a company is paying people below a living wage, the extent to which it's paying people in the supply chain below a fair trade price, the extent to which it's polluting the environment, emitting global warming gases, and causing biodiversity loss. And in particular, it doesn't take account of the costs of avoiding those detriments, or where they're occurring, at least cleaning up the mess. In other words, it doesn't actually account for the true costs of business. And as a result, the measured profit doesn't reflect what one might describe as being a fair or just profit. And indeed, I suggest that whenever the board of a company signs off its accounts as being a true and fair representation of its financial position, it's doing no such thing. It's neither true nor fair. It's not true because it doesn't represent the true costs of the business, and it's not fair because it then doesn't measure a fair or just profit. Now we know that this is the case, and we categorize these things as being externalities. They are due to market failures, failures of competition, regulation, taxation, and things like that. Now, what I suggest in the book is that that's not a correct description, because actually these things are absolutely intrinsic and internal to the firm, not extrinsic and external. They're internal and intrinsic because they're at the heart of business. They're at the heart of the determination of a profit of a business. And that so long as one misdiagnoses the nature of the problem, one fails to prescribe the right policy prescriptions. So, for example, competition can have completely perverse effects. So, for example, increased competition encourages a process by which good firms that do incur their true costs and earn a just or fair profit cannot compete against bad firms that do not and earn larger profits. And that's what people who operate in business complain about all of the time. You know, in many cases, they have enlightened leaders who would like to do this, but they feel they just can't do it because they can't compete. And indeed, as a consequence of this, increased competition encourages a run to the bottom, not to the top, because good firms are outcompeted by bad firms, and capital flows from good firms to bad firms. It's a sort of Gresham law of the bad firms driving out the good. And regulation fails because what regulation does is it simply raises the costs of companies or stops companies from doing things. And so it's extremely controversial. On the political left, we get people saying we need more regulation and better enforcement of regulation. And on the right, political right, we have people who say, no, 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 that's an infringement of our liberties and freedom, and it gives rise to lower investment, less jobs, lower growth, etc. And this is a basic cause of the polarization that we see and social divisions in societies around the world. So the traditional policy tools are proving to be increasingly inadequate. And so what I suggest in the book is we've got to rethink the nature of the problem and the way to address the problem. And what I argue is that what is needed is for companies to refocus their ambitions and raise their sights from what I term here as being wading in the weeds of entanglement, exploitation, and unjust enrichment, of profiting from inflicting detriments as well as benefits on others, and instead surf the waves of initiative, innovation, and inspiration, of earning not just this small slug of grey just profit there, but also from finding ways of capitalizing and earning revenues from creating social improvements and environmental improvements. And when one does this, when one shifts the objectives of firms from being down here to being up here, then two remarkable things happen. First of all, competition, far from creating a run to the bottom, does what it's supposed to do, creates a run to the top, because good firms that earn a just profit, as shown in grey there, are outcompeted by better firms that find innovative ways of earning this just profit increment and creating revenues from doing them. And perhaps still more significantly, what this does is it produces a natural partnership between government and business, where at the moment there's often conflict between the two. It creates a natural partnership because it aligns the interest of the public sector in creating social improvements and environmental improvements with that of business that wants to earn fair and just profits from their activities. So it encourages a partnership between business and government, which allows business to be able to capitalize on these benefits that it's conferring. Because it's the interest then of government to invest with business, to procure from businesses, to subsidize businesses that do deliver benefits and profit from delivering benefits rather than from delivering detriments. So it's potentially an extremely powerful way of both delivering on public sector objectives and also enhancing the performance of companies and allowing them to create value, financial value from so doing. But it's not just that it creates a partnership between business and government. It creates a natural partnership between business and its other stakeholders, with its customers who become more loyal customers, with its employees who become more engaged employees, with its suppliers and societies who become more sustaining contributors to the company. And that element reflects what I was talking about at the beginning, the low level of trust in business at the moment. It's not just that trust is something that is inherently good, which it probably is, but that it's also commercially exceedingly detrimental for companies. And if companies can enhance their levels of trust, they benefit from having, for example, more loyal customers and more engaged employees and suppliers. So, of course, the question that this raises is, well, how does one actually do this? And at the heart of it is something that's very fundamental to business, namely the reason why business is created, why it exists, its reason for being, namely its purpose, its corporate purpose. And as I said, Milton Friedman had a clear notion of what a purpose of a business is, and that is to make money, and he's not wrong about that. But what I'm saying that he's missing is the question of from where does that money come from? And really, no, what I'm saying here is not very different from the old Confucian notion that what is needed of merchants and traders is to make money the right way. That's basically what I'm saying here, that companies should profit from creating benefits, not detriments, for others. And the way in which I describe that in terms of a corporate purpose is to say that the purpose of a business is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. Now, that notion of a corporate purpose is something that business is really beginning to grasp as of significance to them in terms of their ability to do what they want to do. And it's gaining their attention for two reasons. Firstly, it's about problem solving. And problem solving is what a strategy of a business is all about. You know, if you go to a strategy meeting of a company, it's all about how do you solve problems about their customers, their employees, their suppliers, etc. How do they create markets for their goods and services? So it's something that is recognized by senior executives as being core to the business. It's not just something they're doing on the side. This is absolutely the core, the overarching framework within which the strategy of a business should sit. And the second reason why it resonates with business and investors is that it's not just about solving problems, it's about solving problems profitably. So it's about financial value creation. And how can companies effectively create more financial value, not less, through doing this? And that aspect of it really makes it very different from the way in which companies at the moment are being exhorted to address these problems. Put simply, this notion of the purpose of a business can be summarized as being profit without harm. Profit without harm is the equivalent of the Hippocratic oath in medicine of do no harm. But it's impossible for business to do no harm. It's doing harm all the time. It's having to make tough choices. It's having to make choices about whether or not to raise prices to consumers to allow it to go on retaining its employees, or whether or not to close a plant, laying off people there, to allow it to open the plant somewhere else and employ other people there. So it's making hard choices all of the time. But what I'm saying is that companies should not profit from inflicting detriments on others. Now, the reason why this is, I think, both different and preferable to the approaches that are being taken in relation to, in particular, regulation, is that this really places a very different emphasis on policy. Let me illustrate this in relation to two major areas of policy development that are currently going on. The first is in terms of what the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, and in particular its International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, is doing in trying to encourage companies to report on their sustainability-related financial risks, as well as their normal financial risks. Now, what this is doing is basically to say that companies should report on how the environment and social risks impinge on the company and their investors. So it's about how environment and society affect companies. So it's not really doing what I'm talking about here, because it's not talking about how does a company affect the environment and society. It's the reverse causation, all right? And so this is very important in thinking about the risks from the point of view of investors, but it's not effectively addressing the concerns we've got about the impact that companies are having on society and the environment. Now, what the second set of initiatives that have been going on in the EU have been doing is to try and address that issue. It's what is termed a double materiality as against a single materiality approach. So this is looking at the impact of companies on society and the environment, and it's requiring companies to report on that in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, and to act on it in terms of incurring the costs of avoiding those detriments in their supply chains in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. Only the EU is finding it can't do this. And in the last month, it introduced a reform called the Omnibus Package, which basically says it's going to delay the implementation of many of the components of this. It's going to exclude companies, some companies altogether, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises. And thirdly, it's going to water down the strength of the regulations across the board. So effectively, it's withdrawing from its very ambitious agenda. And the reason why it's withdrawing is basically what this does is exactly what I was saying earlier on about regulation. All it seemed to be doing is to raise the costs of European businesses, and European businesses complain that therefore they're becoming uncompetitive. They're having to engage in excessive amounts of very costly reporting, and it's undermining the growth and investment of European economies. So they've been driven, essentially, to scale back their ambitions in this area. Now, I think what this brings out is the fact that one does have to think beyond just traditional policy tools for doing this. And in terms of what I'm talking about, the aspect of measurement that's involved here is far more straightforward and far more intuitive for companies than any of these proposals. Part of the problem with these proposals is they're incredibly complex. In many cases, they're requiring companies to attach monetary values to things like environmental and social impact. That's all very complex. What I'm talking about here is very straightforward. What is the impact that a company has on the environment, which should be, and society, which is measured not in monetary terms in general, but straightforward key performance indicators. You know, to what extent is a company having a detrimental impact in terms of its emissions, its global warming emissions? And then, what are the costs that it needs to incur to avoid those detriments? So that all this is traditional cost accounting. It's simply saying, account for your true costs and incur your true costs in terms of avoiding the detriments, but in particular then, focus on what you're then defining as being a fair profit, namely a profit that is net of the costs of imposing detriments. So it actually encourages, and this is the important point, it brings an alignment between investors' interests in profit and companies' attempts to create innovative solutions to problems of people and planet. So it's basically saying, this is not something where one's trying to just add on objectives alongside financial performance. It's saying the interest of investors is in earning a profit that comes from producing solutions, not detriments. So it's aligning the notion of the financial interest with what we as individuals and societies look to have. Okay, so that's the basis. Now, what I want to just focus on before I conclude is, this has a lot of implications for many aspects of the way in which companies run themselves in terms of their governance, as I describe here in terms of the way in which they measure their activities. But it also has an important implication for the nature of the investors and owners themselves. And in particular, a core component of what's being put forward here requires the presence of at least some owners in the business, and in particular, the dominant and controlling owners, to take a long-term perspective of the purpose of the business. And in that regard, the developments that have been taking place in the ownership of Japanese companies is very interesting and very significant, because Japan has gone through massive fluctuations in the nature of its own ownership, corporate ownership. From after the Second World War, when the Zaibetsus were dissolved, it looked initially basically like a US economy with a lot of dispersed, diversified shareholdings on the stock market. That quickly disappeared after a stock market crash and was replaced by bank ownership, leading to the high growth era in the 1980s, etc., until the banking collapse started at the beginning of the 1990s, and then we had the lost decade and the dissolution of the bank shareholdings. So that brings us into this century, when we see growing levels of outside ownership again, in particular institutional and foreign institutional ownership, as I mentioned, and declining levels of insider ownership. But the initial response was for management to try and protect itself from the outside investors through cross-shareholdings. And it's that then gave rise to the Abe economic reform, which was trying to deal with the problem in terms of encouraging a dissolution of the cross-shareholdings. And that happened. But as you can see from this slide, between 2010 and 2020, the levels of insider ownership leveled off. And they leveled off because, although the cross-shareholdings have in large part been dissolved, we have not seen the absence of shareholdings of companies in other companies. It's just that the nature of those shareholdings has changed, but changed in a very significant way. Because instead of them being cross-shareholdings by which company A holds shares in companies B and vice versa, they involve company A taking a strategic shareholding in company B. And let me just illustrate the sort of thing that goes on in this regard. And what's quite interesting about this is not only is it a change in the nature of ownership, but we also observe a very interesting phenomenon that management is managing its ownership. Okay, we don't normally talk about management as determining their ownership, but that is precisely what Japanese management has been doing, in particular over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, this illustrates the case of Suzuki, which in 2006 repurchased a block of shares from General Motors, who for a variety of reasons wanted to sell its share block in Suzuki. And Suzuki did not want the shares to be dispersed on the market for the reasons that I was mentioning. And what it did was, it then repurchased the stock, put it into treasury stock, which is actually, in terms of its scale, a quite distinctive feature of Japanese companies, and then very quickly placed some of those shares, around 2%, into 3 Japanese companies, Nippon Steel, JFE Steel, and Mizuho the bank. And then 3 years later, placed a large block of 20% with the European car company Volkswagen. Now that management of blocks of shares, in this case it's a transfer of a block from one block shareholder, General Motors, largely to Volkswagen, is also in many cases actually the creation of blocks, where companies buy shares in the market, repurchase their shares in the market, and place them with a large strategic corporate investor. Now, the importance of emphasizing this is, it's very different from the cross-shareholdings. And what one observes is that far from the stock market reacting negatively to this, it reacts positively in terms of the share price reaction of companies when they do this. And the reason is that in essence what the company is doing is to create a shareholding that is helping to deliver on its purpose. Okay? So it's actually creating the sorts of partnerships that are needed for a company to be able to deliver on its partnership. And I just want to illustrate these points a little bit further with one final example, and then I'll draw it to a close. And that is of a Danish company, a Danish pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk, which makes insulin that's used in the treatment of diabetes. It used to think that its purpose was simply to produce insulin and to sell it at as high a price as possible. But then it realized that there was a problem with its purpose, and that is that 80% of type 2 diabetes is found in low and middle income countries which could not afford to purchase its insulin. So it started to rethink its purpose, and it concluded that its purpose was not simply to make as much money out of selling insulin as possible, but to help people treat diabetes and, if possible, avoid getting it. So it started working with hospitals, doctors, and universities, governments, local authorities, and health workers around the world to identify ways in which people could avoid getting type 2 diabetes and, where necessary, treat it in ways that might not involve taking insulin, in particular through nutritional changes. Now, you might say, well, that's all very well and very noble, but doesn't it undermine the fundamental model of Novo Nordisk to make money out of selling insulin? And the answer is no, because in the process of doing this, its business blossomed and it became a highly profitable company. And the reason for this is that it created relations with its universities, hospitals, doctors, governments, etc., relationships of trust, by which it became a trusted provider of not just insulin, but on many pharmaceutical products, and also advice to governments and hospitals and doctors. Now, I think this brings out three important points. The first one is the importance of having clarity about what a purpose is, and in particular recognizing that a purpose is absolutely core to the business. It's not just something that's done to make the company look good. It's the driver of what the business is there to do. And companies have to go through this process, this journey of discovering what their purpose is, as Novo Nordisk did. The second thing that I think comes out of this is that no company can solve major world problems on their own. They have to do it in partnership with other companies, with other not-for-profit organizations, with governments. And that's why, coming back to this strategic investment of companies in each other in Japan, that's an important observation of the sorts of relationships that companies have to develop in terms of having the necessary abilities and skills to deliver on really ambitious problem-solving purposes. And the third thing that I'd bring out is that if you can do this, if you can bring a real commitment to a meaningful problem-solving purpose, it creates the most valuable asset that a company can have. And that is to be trusted, to be seen to be trustworthy, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. That's an essential part of the commercial success of a business. But the thing that this slide actually brings out is, again, the importance of ownership. And what this brings out is a very important element that I think is central to the debate that's going on in Japan at the moment, in terms of the dual nature of the ownership of the company. It has institutional shareholders and individual shareholders, very large number of them, very dispersed, diversified shareholders, who have about 70% of the capital of Novo Nordisk. But it's also got, and those shares are actively traded on the Danish and the New York stock market. But it also has another shareholder, the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is literally a foundation, a charity, that has only approximately 30% of the equity capital, but has nearly 80% of the votes in the company. It's a dual-class share structure, which allows Novo Nordisk to provide the long-term focus on the purpose of the business and allows it to remain committed to that purpose. Now, I emphasize this in the context of Japan because I think that this is a critical juncture. It's a critical juncture in which the Abe reforms, as I said at the beginning, have basically done the job. But going forward, the question is, well, how much further does one want to go in this direction? And I'd suggest that one should proceed with caution, because to give you a warning example, the country which probably has one of the most diversified shareholdings of any country in the world and the best systems of minority shareholder protection of anywhere in the world is the UK. And the UK has frankly had a rather disastrous business and economic performance, at least over the last 20 or 30 years, and arguably longer. And there's a good reason why that observation on the nature of ownership is related to the observation on its performance. Because a fundamental problem in Britain has been a problem of investment, or rather lack of investment. And that lack of investment has really reflected the fact that an economy that's dominated by dispersed shareholders has one serious detriment. It doesn't have committed shareholders. And therefore, thinking at this stage as to, well, who are going to be the committed shareholders who are going to do the sorts of things that the Novo Nordisk Foundation does in Novo Nordisk to ensure the retention of the long-term purpose. That is going to be an absolutely critical question for Japan going forward. And I just end by observing that in contrast to the rather dire performance of the UK economy, but also not just its economic performance, but also the sorts of social problems that have arisen, Denmark, which is a country which has the largest proportion of foundation-owned enterprises of any country in the world, also happens to be a country that has one of the highest GDPs per capita, lowest levels of inequality, best employee-employer relations, and is also one of the happiest countries in the world. And again, there probably is a significant relationship between the nature of its ownership and the nature of the performance of both its economy and society. Now, there are many other things that I could talk about in relation to what is needed to really bring about these types of changes, but I've clearly run out of time, and so I can only ask you, please, to read my book instead.